Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Today we go international. So, Matt, explain to our audience why we're international today.
Sure, Tom. Hello to everybody from Lisbon, Portugal, where I am attending the European Conference of the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. We have, I don't know, at least 350 people downstairs from North America, South America, a lot of Europeans and Middle Eastern, very eclectic global audience. And for those who are curious about the weather report, I can say that, alas, it is rather dreary and rainy in Lisbon. I am told that is unusual. It is my first time in the city, and I am stuck in this hotel while it drizzles away outside. But the conference itself is great. I will say that. It is an excellent and informative event here.
So, Matt, you wrote a interesting blog post this week, or I guess posted actually today, entitled Two Examples of Compliance Issues in Trump 2.0. And as noted in the title, you have two different instances or examples, but they were very different. And I thought actually they provided quite a bit of lessons learned for the compliance professional that we could articulate in this podcast. Why don't you tell us about your blog post?
Sure. So this just kind of came to me yesterday as I was reading the news over the weekend. There were two different news articles I encountered that really captured what I think are some lessons to learn, or more accurately, maybe points to ponder about compliance issues that are likely to confront large organizations in the Trump administration. They are two very different subjects, as you said, but one is an article from Politico that talked about the Trump administration starting to investigate environmental groups and how environmental groups will need strong capabilities in compliance to handle that. And the other one is the report now that the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, they have approached the Trump administration about some sort of deal for mineral extraction rights in the Congo, which potentially could be quite lucrative, except Congo is also one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. How is this going to work that the Congo would exchange mineral extraction rights in exchange for Trump administration support of the government there, which also is in disarray? We can talk about that. But that second story, which was in the Financial Times, that really brought home to me this emerging issue of Trump's pause of FCPA enforcement to do what? According to the order, it was about maintaining strategic advantages for the U.S. in things like mineral extraction. And how is this going to work if we see these deals emerge that are riddled with corruption risk and Trump is trying to wave them away? So we have issue one with the environmental groups thinking about litigation and investigation from the Trump administration. We have issue two about corruption risks, that how are they going to manifest and emerge in this big deal making that, of course, Donald Trump loves to do. And both of them are good bookends for what I think are going to be problems that will be recurring for a lot of large organizations in years to come.
So I have written and talked about both of the issues that you articulated for numerous years. So let's start with the environmental entities and what is the Trump administration threatening, and why is compliance at least one of the solutions?
So here is the backstory, and I have links to these articles if you want to go and read them from the original source. But this first appeared in Politico, that the interim U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C., Ed Martin, has sent letters to various environmental groups who had received grants from the Environmental Protection Administration under the Biden administration. And now Martin and the EPA under the Trump administration are saying, clearly these grants given were riddled with fraud. So we want you to prepare to defend yourself because you are now under investigation. So Mr. Martin was sending out these demand letters to groups, and what he wanted were copies of all of these groups' communications with EPA staff and any records related to transaction records related to this grant program, which was about reducing greenhouse gases. So he wanted all of that, and he wanted copies of these groups' articles of incorporation and their policies and procedures for managing the grants. Now, color me skeptical that there is much there. I think that the EPA and Mr. Martin are basically on witch hunts to hassle groups that took money from an administration this one doesn't like to address issues that this administration doesn't believe are true. And I think this is a lot of baloney that Mr. Martin and the EPA are cooking up. Maybe I'm wrong. However, clearly, if you're being told to produce transaction records, policies and procedures for grant handling, things like that, you cannot do that well if you don't have strong compliance capabilities. Regardless of exactly where you house those capabilities, if it's in a dedicated compliance program or it's in a legal program or whatever, you're going to need to be able to have produce evidence, documentation, record keeping, transaction records, policy manuals, procedure documentation, all of the unsexy, unglamorous part of compliance. That's going to become very important because Mr. Martin and probably other U.S. attorneys, certainly other senior executives in this Trump administration, in this Justice Department, they have made no qualms about they're going to weaponize the department's resources to go after political opponents, quite possibly for very bogus, specious means or reasons, but you will have to defend yourself. Suddenly, these unglamorous parts become very critical to your ability to get rid of these witch hunts and knock them down. And look, if there's actual fraud, if Mr. Martin is right, pick me up off the floor because I'll faint. But if he is right, then absolutely he should root out the fraud. But regardless of whether there is fraud or isn't fraud, if you have these demand letters from a U.S. attorney or some other federal agency, you're going to have to comply with that. You're going to need some capacity to engage with them, regardless of their motives. And this is going to become a more and more important skill for compliance teams in the future, because I think this department and these prosecutors, they're just getting started trying to investigate everybody under the sun who has ever looked at them cross-eyed or has ever thought the Biden administration was legit.
And I've long tried to advocate that compliance is not simply about complying with the US FCPA or other regulatory aspect, because every corporation has a number of stakeholders, and compliance is a key if you get into some sort of imbroglio, whether that's reputational, legal, financial, or other, and that demonstrating you have complied with whatever it is through your books and records and your internal controls, I think can be a key element in beginning a turnaround. Even if this is just a made up exercise by the Trump administration to intimidate these entities, if they put all of this out to the public, I think it's just going to make the Trump administration look worse. Not that they care about looking worse, but I think compliance is the key. And I think you're spot on that this is the way to answer these types of inquiries, good, bad, indifferent, or fastidious. So I absolutely believe that you're spot on your blog post, and having those policies and procedures in place, following those policies and procedures, and documenting what you have done is an appropriate legal response, and it's appropriate reputational response. And right now it may be the best response.
Tom, I have 2 points I want to emphasize here. First, for anybody who's thinking, okay, Matt and Tom are correct at the abstract level, but this is kind of an obscure thing to go and pick out and hold up as an example. Look, this is only going to be the first. And for other examples, imagine you are Columbia University, which now has suddenly been told that they have lost $400 million in federal funding. That is an illegal severance of federal funding. There is a procedure to follow to cut off the university, which involves due process, which Trump's order or tweet or whatever he sent out about Columbia to cut off that funding. He didn't follow that. But at some point, there is going to be a challenge and a process to this. So if you're in higher ed, certainly Columbia is not going to be the only university Trump decides to go after. You will need a capacity to engage with the regulators then. Or if you are part of a recipient of one of these fishing expeditions the Justice Department has said it will go on for illegal DEI programs, there is no definition of an illegal DEI program. But the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has made quite clear that she's looking to investigate companies, possibly criminally, for running a DEI program. Somebody somewhere is going to get that demand letter, and you will need some sort of capacity to respond. So anybody who thinks this is an obscure example to cite, I'm only citing it because it's the easy first one that's come along. But this is only going to be the first. And I think that Yeah, that leads into my second point is that I don't think that we should get hung up on a compliance program. It's not that you should have a program to demonstrate that you have a program to satisfy compliance guidelines or the US sentencing guidelines or anything like that. If you have a compliance program, a dedicated thing to show that you are obeying a certain requirement, you've misread the assignment. This is more about, do you have compliance capabilities to handle stuff that happens? And that's really going to become the fixed concept, I think, for life in the Trump administration, which is nothing but chaos and unpredictability and these arbitrary pronouncements from the department, from the White House, from Elon or Twitter, wherever it's going to come from. And even if you don't have a dedicated compliance program, and perhaps some very small organizations are going to get caught up in this, they will still need a compliance capability. And that's how we need to start thinking about this. Do we have the right capabilities to respond to whatever wackadoo stuff might come up from the Trump administration, from a state regulator, from overseas, from the media, for something like that? You're going to need to be able to provide evidence that you have res- held yourself responsibly and comported yourself responsibly and ethically. Is it in a compliance and ethics program? Yes, great. Is it not? I don't care. You still need those capabilities. And that's really going to become a message that compliance officers will have to emphasize with the rest of the business, who might be thinking, we now have a get out of jail free card. Let's cut the budget for the program. If you are cutting the budget for the program, that means less compliance capabilities. That means at some point, something is going to come up and catch you unawares, and that's when you're going to feel the folly of that decision to cut the capabilities.
And I would just add, it's not the regulators, it's stakeholders.
Yes.
So that would be a wide variety of entities, persons, or perhaps even others. But that, Matt, it also moves to a larger point you have made multiple times, which is it's not compliance risk, it's risk. And 6 weeks ago, this may not have been a risk, or on January 19th, it may not have been a risk for these entities, but now it's a risk, and that risk is a thing, as my daughter might say. And so if your risk management program allows you to not only anticipate or see down the road, but respond to risks, that's what compliance officers need to be thinking about, because we don't know what the next risk might be, and certainly not for the next 3+ years.
No, we do not. And I'll have one final point on this is that, for example, I bet many higher education institutions never anticipated the risk of a president unilaterally announcing that he is immediately cutting off all federal funding because they support anti-Semitism or they tolerate it or whatever. They didn't have any, I don't know, but I suspect some of them do not have any plans to handle that risk, because that risk it was illegal. It is illegal. There is a process to begin to go through to resolve whether or not a university should lose federal funding. And Trump didn't engage in that. He just chucked that over the window to say, I ain't giving them any more money. Now, could Columbia challenge that in court? Yes. Could they therefore maybe prevail? Maybe not. Kind of depends on the judge and how the higher courts go. But nonetheless, there are now new risks coming along nobody entertained before, because this administration is behaving in ways that nobody entertained before, because the rules don't matter much to this administration, and certainly not to the president, who really just tweets it, sees if he can get away with it. You will need compliance capabilities that can withstand that very arbitrary, unpredictable, and difficult environment. And that'll be my last for this point.
Let's move on to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because I see this perhaps in a little bit different light. So why don't you give us the backstory on this, Matt?
Okay, so the Democratic Republic of the Congo is in Africa. It has potentially enormous wealth in the form of critical minerals. The problem for the Congo is that its country is an economic and governmental basket case in real difficulty. It is one of the poorest countries in the world. It is, according to any number of corruption perception index benchmarks out there, one of the most corrupt governments in the world. And the government is not even, in fact, stable today. It is in the midst of trying to quell an armed rebellion in the eastern part of it. So the government there, led by one President Felix Tedeschi, I believe, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, But he has approached the Trump administration to say, let's do a deal. I will give the United States mineral extraction rights in exchange for the Trump administration propping up my government. We don't know exactly what that means. I don't know that it means sending U.S. soldiers into the Congo to put down the Rwandan-backed rebels or anything like that. But nonetheless, he is trying to do a deal and dangling mineral extraction rights to the United States as the bait. Let's consider this is exactly the sort of scenario that Trump's executive order pausing the FCPA mentioned. His executive order, right there in the text, said that it is important that the United States, meaning the president, have the ability to advance U.S. foreign policy interests. Yeah, I get that theory. That I don't know if I have the exact quote here, but basically saying that the ability for the government and companies in the United States to do strategic deals supersedes adherence to the FCPA. It didn't say that. I'm paraphrasing now. But if, for example, critical minerals in the Congo are so important to U.S. interests and U.S. companies don't want to go in there because they are afraid of FCPA risk, then the president should waive FCPA risk and say, we're not going to prosecute you. Knock yourself out, go into the Congo and develop these minerals. This is where I'm really starting to wonder about the executive order with the FCPA pause. And I will admit I'm a bit torn because I'm not necessarily opposed to some critical assets being in U.S. hands. Tom, I wrote about this last week, actually, when I don't know why more people didn't notice this, but BlackRock, the giant investment firm, acquired the two ports that control access to the Panama Canal. They bought it out from the Chinese ownership of those two ports that had owned it. And this also was, I think, in the Financial Times. Now, to be clear, nobody is saying that BlackRock engaged in any bribery or corruption. There's no whiff of FCPA issues in that Panama Canal deal. But control of strategic ports was another one that was clearly expressed in that order. My question is more like, how is this supposed to work in practice if Trump says, I'm going to waive anti-corruption enforcement on these sorts of deals? Now you, U.S. companies, please go and develop them. What U.S. business in their right mind really wants to go into the Congo? It is corrupt as the day is long. It is physically unsafe. It's not entirely sure. It's going to cost a fortune to extract these minerals. And now you're going to do that, but you get what from the Trump administration to assure you won't face anti-corruption prosecution? Are we going to ask for an FCPA opinion release? Do you get some more ironclad assurance? How ironclad is it really? Because we just said 5 minutes ago, Trump has no problem breaking the law if that's what he thinks he can do. Supreme Court has literally told him he can. He has already tried to not follow through on government contracts and whatnot. So he gives you some assurance that you won't get prosecuted to set up mineral rights in the Congo or to acquire ports at a strategic canal or to redevelop the Gaza Strip and put in a casino or to go into a joint venture with Russia for undersea oil exploration in the Arctic. We could go on and on with potential scenarios where normally a business would say, nope, too corrupt, not going to touch it with the 10-foot pole. And now Trump is saying, no, you can feel free to grab it with both hands. How is this going to work? And I don't know. I'm not entirely opposed to some of the point he's trying to make. I do think the Panama Canal ideally should be in U.S. control, not China. I'm not necessarily sure I love the idea of a joint undersea oil exploration with Russia, but he's talked about that too. We have more and more examples of how this might look, and now I'm trying to roll out the FCPA compliance and risk implications of it. I'll stop there, Tom, because I would welcome your thoughts on this.
So I'm going to stick with the DRC example, Matt, because I find this is something that I think our government should engage in, and they should have government to government level talks about the access to either minerals or other resources in countries. There's a couple of ways to pay for this. The United States could make a direct grant to the DRC, some form or another. But remember, The FCPA does not prevent a company from paying directly to the government. And if Tom Fox Energy Company wants to exploit minerals in the DRC and they strike a deal with the president of the DRC, no matter how corrupt he is, and they write a check DRC payable to, that's not an FCPA violation.
Mhm.
And indeed, payment to any government entity is not an FCPA violation. I recognize that may create a whole set of other problems, but I don't think, and here you specifically called out the security and you're spot on that. If you want to make a $5 million payment to make sure you have Army troops around your mining site in the DRC, that may be a facilitation payment. Very big one, but paying for police services is something that energy companies have done literally around the world. And the distinction is only the payment to the government of the country in question. And I think it's an appropriate discussion for our U.S. government to have. And I think if Trump wants to tell Tom Fox Energy, go exploit away, Tom, and we'll turn our heads, he doesn't have to turn his head if I'm going to write a check to the DRC. What the DRC does after they get that money is the DRC's responsibility. There's a famous or infamous case out of Italy where Shell and E&I were charged with corruption for paying the government of Nigeria for oil concessions on a specific block. And the government specifically used that money to pay individual government officials bribes. The court said, sorry, you're paying it to the government. What they do with it after they get it's there, up to them. And we're not in the business right now of going after companies that pay governments. I'm not offended by those discussions. I don't see that Trump's suspension of the FCPA would be a part of it, the discussion going forward.
I agree with that in principle, that there isn't anything wrong with a company making a payment directly to the government of the GRC. However, here in the real world, we also know that you're going to have to make more bribery payments on top of that. You can pay the Defense Department in Congo, such that it is $5 million to send troops to protect your employees. Absolutely, you're going to wind up with the colonel who's out there actually running the troops, demanding an extra hit or an extra cut to be able to actually have them show up and do their jobs. This is going to happen, that there will be corruption there. And we could spool up any number of ways of how is this going to work, that you make the payment to a corrupt government, but there aren't corruption payments in addition. Is there really going to be a Congolese Department of Bribery Distribution that hands it out to the state and local officials who will be shaking you down? Because that is going to happen. You were still going to need some sort of assurance that when the bribery incident comes, because it is going to, I don't care how much money you pay to the government, somebody else is going to be there with their hand out on the sly. How do you get insurance that you won't have that come back to bite you in the rear end? I don't trust the Trump administration when it says, we won't prosecute you. Never mind that a different administration could come in 2029 and say, I don't care what the Justice Department under Trump said about FCPA turning a blind eye to it. We're not going to turn a blind eye to it. How is that actually going to work? Because we never have gone through this before. I'm not sure we've thought through the mechanisms to make sure that if this is what we're going to do, that we are going to allow corruption in some instances, if that means the U.S. gets to develop a canal or get access to mineral rights or something like that, and there are corrupt payments to government officials, not government officials specifically, not just the government. How are we going to make sure that doesn't bite us in the rear end? Because we've never had to think about it before, because it's never been contemplated before. But here we are. And I don't know, Tom. So that's my response to your response to my initial thought.
Perhaps we can circle back to why compliance needs to think about risk. Because if the risk is the country or the high risk geography, it may not matter that the FCPA allows a payment directly to a foreign government or a state agency of foreign government or a department of a foreign government. If the risk is so great that all the other officials are going to have their hands out for personal payments, maybe if we start thinking about it differently, that might lead us to a different answer and might lead companies to conclude, you're right, this risk is just too high, particularly after this administration leaves.
So that leads me to my next step down the road, which I think will eventually happen. What if they strike this deal either in the Congo or in the Ukraine or some other place? And now you could, in theory, go in and develop these very lucrative mineral extraction opportunities, but there's corruption risk. And now you look at it and say, okay, so the corruption risk doesn't matter. However, this still seems like financially it's not an interesting deal for me. I don't want it. Our company's not going to do it. And now the Trump administration comes back and says, okay, maybe you didn't understand what we said. We said we really want the extraction rights. You, Western company, we expect you to go in and develop them. But it's not economically viable. We'll give you a cut on taxes. We'll give you something else. Let's remember who this is at the top of the administration. It is this wannabe deal maker who is perfectly happy to pull any levers of power he can to get what he wants. I do not think it is far-fetched to go from you don't have to worry about corruption risk, still go into the country, to we don't want to go into this country. I don't care, company. I'm the Trump administration. I'm telling you, you have to go in. Let's give you some other sweeteners or threats or something. So I don't think that's far-fetched at all, that the administration is going to give people a big shove when it wants something done. And I think that's a problem above the pay grade, I think, of a lot of corporate compliance officers. But that is a problem CEOs and boards should consider now, because I will bet my mortgage payment that fact pattern is going to come sometime during the Trump administration. I don't know when, I don't know the circumstances, but will Trump eventually order a business to do something it does not want to do? Yes, absolutely.
The only thing I would point you to historically is after the 2008 economic crash, the U.S. government sued all of those companies after they helped out the government. So you'll probably take it on both sides.
Yeah. So again, it was an interesting confluence. Both of these articles against the environmental activists groups with their grants, and now here this mineral extraction issue. I think both of them demonstrate the sort of compliance challenges that will be forthcoming. And corporations would be wise, I think, to just ponder them and anticipate what are our integrity values? How committed are we to be able to say no to something that is unpalatable? That's the minerals extraction point. What compliance capabilities do we really have to be able to handle this administration that might come at us sometime from some direction we're not expecting, legal or illegal, right or wrong? Here it comes. How are we going to show our homework to make sure that the teacher will go and bother some other student instead? Those are the kind of things that we all need to think about, because that's the world that we live in now.
Matt, that seems like a great place to end this podcast. I can't wait to see what we can come up with next week.
Thank you, Tom.